The morning I stopped being invisible started the same way every other morning had for 11 years, with the sound of his coffee grinder at 5:45, the particular aggression he brought to that machine, like it owed him something. I lay in bed and counted the rotations. 7 seconds. 8. The grinder stopped. I heard him set his mug on the marble counter with that small, deliberate click that meant he was in a good mood. On bad mornings, he set it down hard. That morning it was a click. I should have been relieved. I wasn't. My name is Mara. I'm 41 years old. For 11 years I was married to a man named Carson, who ran a commercial real estate development firm out of downtown Chicago. Carson was the kind of man who got upgraded on flights without asking, who got tables at restaurants that had month-long wait lists, who remembered the first names of every Michter, who'd ever seated him and forgot the birthdays of both his children from his first marriage. He was also the kind of man who decided one evening in March that I needed to be taught a lesson. We had been at dinner, his colleague Raymond's birthday, a private room at a steakhouse on Michigan Avenue, the kind where they don't put prices on the menu. There were 12 people at the table. I had known most of them for years. I had smiled through hundreds of evenings exactly like that one. But that night, Raymond's wife had leaned across the table and asked me about the Lakeview project, a mixed-use development Carson's firm had been working on for 2 years. I happened to know the project well. Before we married, I'd worked as a senior project manager at a commercial development firm myself. I knew what questions to ask. I knew what the delays meant. I said something, honestly, something fairly mild about why the zoning variance was taking so long. Carson's expression didn't change, not visibly, but his hand found my wrist under the table and pressed once, the way you'd press a button. In the car on the way home, he was quiet for the first 6 blocks. Then he said, "You made me look like I don't have control of my own project." I said I was just answering a question. He said, "I'll decide what questions you answer." When we got home, he carried his jacket upstairs without another word. I stood in our kitchen for a moment, still in my coat. Then I followed him up. He was in the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. He came out, looked at me and said, "Sleep in the study. You can come back when you've thought about what you said. I want to tell you I said something devastating right then. I didn't." I said, "Okay." I took my pillow from my side of the bed and walked down the hall. The study was a long, narrow room at the back of our house, a 3-story brownstone in Lincoln Park that we bought 6 years ago. Carson had designed the study himself, or rather, he'd told the architect exactly what he wanted. Built-in bookshelves floor to ceiling, a leather chair he'd had shipped from London, a drafting table he never used, one window that looked out into the neighbor's yard. I sat in that leather chair in the dark and thought, how long has this been happening? Not the study, I mean the other thing. The pressing of the wrist, the deciding which questions I answered. The good mood clicks versus the bad mood slams. I thought about my job, the one I'd left when we moved into this house because Carson had said it didn't make sense for both of us to have demanding careers, and honestly, at the time, I believed him. I'd made $400,000 the year before I stopped. It had seemed temporary. It had seemed like a choice. I sat in that leather chair and I thought about the word choice for a very long time. The drafting table caught my eye. It was pushed against the wall, slightly dusty, but underneath it, in the deep bottom drawer of the built-in cabinet, I knew Carson kept a portable fireproof safe. He'd shown it to me once, years ago, said it was where he kept the deed to the house and some other documents in case anything happened. I had never thought about it after that. I thought about it now. I didn't open anything that night. I just sat there. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. In the morning, he came into the study at 7. He was already dressed, suit jacket, the blue one, which meant a client meeting. He looked at me in the chair and said, "Have you thought about it?" I said yes. He said, "Good." Then he straightened his cuff and left. I heard the front door. I heard his car in the alley. I sat there another 10 minutes, perfectly still. Then I got up and started making phone calls. The first call was to my college roommate, a woman named Josephine, who had spent the last 15 years as a family law attorney in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We had stayed close the way women sometimes do, texting sporadically, calling every few months, being immediately back in sync whenever we did. I had been in her wedding. She had flown to Chicago twice since mine, and both times she'd looked at Carson with the careful, neutral expression of someone who was being polite. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened. Not just the dinner, not just the study. I went back further. I told her about the job. I told her about the wrist. I told her about the time 2 years ago when I had wanted to take a consulting contract, and he had sat across from me at our kitchen table and explained, calmly, why it wasn't a good idea, and how by the end of the conversation I had agreed with him and had not understood, until now, that I had been managed. Josephine listened without interrupting. That is one of her gifts. When I finished, she said, "Mara, how are the assets structured?" I told her I didn't know exactly. The house was in both our names, I knew that. But the investment accounts, the firm, those I'd never had full access to. He handled the finances. He'd always said he preferred to. She said, "Okay, here's what I need you to do." She walked me through it, carefully, methodically. I wrote everything down on the back of a grocery receipt I found in my jacket pocket because I didn't want to use any paper in the house. The second call I made that afternoon, after I'd driven to a coffee shop on Armitage, was to a woman named Simone. Simone had been my assistant at the firm years ago. She had since moved to a financial advisory practice on the North Shore. We'd had lunch twice a year, every year, without fail, even after I stopped working. She was one of those people who stayed. I called her and told her I needed someone who could help me understand how assets might be structured to obscure them from a spouse in the event of a divorce. There was a pause. Then she said, "Is this hypothetical?" I said no. She said, "Come to my office tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Here is what 11 years of invisibility teaches you. How to move through a space without drawing attention. How to ask questions that sound like small talk. How to be in a room and have no one remember you were there." For 3 weeks, I was invisible on purpose. Carson had not told me to leave the study. I had not told him I was staying. It was one of those arrangements that forms without discussion, like ice on a window. I slept there. He slept in our room. He came to the study door some mornings and leaned against the frame, and we talked about ordinary things. Groceries, the cleaners, a dinner we had coming up at the end of the month. He seemed satisfied. He seemed to believe the lesson was in progress. It was, just not the lesson he intended. Through Simone, I found out that Carson had set up 2 LLCs in Delaware, standard practice in commercial real estate, not inherently suspicious, but the structure of them was. One held ownership interest in 3 properties that I had not known about. One received management fees from the firm that were not reflected in the joint tax returns we filed. Simone explained it to me at her office with the spreadsheet open on her screen, and I sat across from her and felt something move through me that was not anger exactly. It was more like clarity. The particular clarity that comes when a picture you've been staring at for years suddenly resolves into focus. I had not known about the properties. I had signed joint tax returns for a decade without looking at them closely. I looked now. The other person who helped me was our neighbor, an older woman named Frances. Frances had lived 4 doors down for 22 years. She was 73. She was the kind of woman who always had too much zucchini from her garden and brought it to you in paper bags. Carson treated her with the tolerant politeness he extended to anyone he found unimportant, which meant he didn't notice that she and I had coffee together at least twice a week. Frances had watched our house, not with any particular intention, just the way people who've lived in one place for a long time watch everything. She knew what cars parked in front, and for how long, and whose. She had mentioned to me once, almost 2 years ago, a woman she'd seen sitting in an Audi in front of our house for 20 minutes on a Saturday morning. She thought it was odd. She hadn't mentioned it again. I hadn't asked. I asked now. She told me. The Audi had come back. Multiple times over the past year. Sometimes the woman got out and walked to the corner. Once she had rung our bell when I wasn't home. Frances had been watching from her porch. Frances asked me what I wanted her to do. I said, "I just need to know I'm not imagining things." She looked at me and said, "You're not imagining anything." She also, without being asked, went through her phone and found that she had taken a photo of the Audi one of the times it was parked outside, the kind of absent-minded photo you take when something strikes you as odd. The plate was visible. I sent it to Josephine. The dinner was April 14th. That part was important because it was a Friday and Carson always played golf on Saturday mornings with his business partner, leaving by 7:15, never back before noon. I had spent that Friday preparing, and I need you to understand what that word means in this context. I had spent 3 weeks preparing, and Friday was the day I moved the preparation into the house. I came home at noon. I went to the study and I sat at the drafting table, the one Carson had never used, and I laid out everything Josephine had told me to bring together: the tax returns from the last 8 years, the mortgage documents, a printout from the county recorder's website of the 3 properties held in the Delaware LLCs which were public record once you knew where to look, Simone's notes printed at her office, Josephine's notes from 4 phone calls, typed out on a document that lived in an email draft I had never sent, a photograph. I had also that morning transferred $20,000 from our joint savings account into an account in my name only, at a bank Carson didn't use. Josephine had been clear this was legal. I was entitled to half the joint funds. She had advised me to do it before I said a word. I looked at everything laid out on the drafting table. I thought about the grocery receipt I'd written notes on. I thought about sitting in the dark in that leather chair. I thought about the word choice. Then I called the one last person I needed to call. A family law attorney in Chicago named Marcus, whom Josephine had referred me to and who had met with me twice in his office in the Loop. I told him I was ready. He said he'd have the documents to me by end of day. Carson came home from golf at 12:45. I heard the garage door. I heard him in the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator. I was in the study. He came to the door and looked in. I was at the drafting table, a glass of water beside me, the documents arranged neatly in front of me. He glanced at the table and his expression shifted, just a fraction, the way it does when something doesn't match what you expected. He said, "You've been busy." I said, "Come sit down." He looked at me. He looked at the table. He didn't sit down, but he came into the room and stood in front of the drafting table, and I watched him process what he was looking at: the tax returns, the county recorder printout, the photograph. He looked at the photograph for a long time. I said, "I've been speaking with an attorney. His name is Marcus Chen. He's filed the petition this morning." Carson said, "You're not serious." I said, "The house is in both our names, which you know. What I also know now is that the Meridian Street property, the one on Fullerton, and the warehouse in Pilsen are held in LLCs that were set up 3 years into our marriage and that I was never told about. Marcus has the structure documented." He was quiet. I said, "I also know about the management fees, and I know that what I signed on our joint returns for the last several years doesn't reflect the complete picture." He said, and I want to remember this exactly, "Mara, you're not a financial person." I looked at him. I thought about $400,000 a year. I thought about a consulting contract I had talked myself out of wanting. I thought about the press of a thumb on a wrist. I said, "I used to be. The mediation took 3 sessions. I want to tell you it was cinematic, that there was a moment when the mask came off entirely, when he said something that revealed everything, but it wasn't like that. It was documents and counter-documents and attorneys talking across a conference table on the 32nd floor of a building on Wacker Drive. It was 2 months of that. Marcus was calm and methodical in the way that good attorneys are. He had a way of laying a document on the table and letting it speak for itself. He did not editorialize. He didn't need to. Carson's attorney was a man named Gerald who was very good at the slow dissolution of confidence. He would present an argument, and Marcus would set a document on the table, and Gerald would wait a moment and then move on. That happened a lot. What happened at the end of the second session is the part I think about. Carson had arrived at that session with a recalibrated strategy. He was doing the thing that I had watched him do in meetings with difficult clients, the controlled warmth, the reasonable man performance. He said he thought we'd gotten away from each other. He said he thought some of this had been a failure of communication. He looked at me across the table with an expression I recognized, the expression that was supposed to make me feel that I was the one being unreasonable. I had seen it so many times. I looked back at him and I felt nothing in particular. That was new. Josephine had flown in for the second session. She was not in the room, she wasn't admitted in Illinois, but she was in the lobby with my phone available if I needed to step out. That had been her idea. She said it helped to know someone was just outside the door. She was right. At the end of the third session, when the documents were finalized and Gerald and Marcus were reviewing the settlement language, Carson pushed back his chair and said, almost to himself, "I built everything in that house." I thought about the study, the leather chair from London, the drafting table no one had ever used. I said quietly, "I know." Then I signed my name. The settlement gave me the house. I had equity arguments that held up cleanly, and Marcus was thorough. It gave me a structured division of the investment assets once the Delaware LLCs were factored in, which took the better part of a month to properly valuate. It also gave me, for the first time in 11 years, complete financial transparency into my own life. I moved some things around after the closing. Josephine flew back to Philadelphia. Simone took me to dinner at a small Italian place in Andersonville that she'd been wanting to try. Frances brought me zucchini, which I made into a bread that turned out badly, and we sat on her porch and laughed about it. I had not laughed like that in a while. My mother, who had driven up from Champaign the weekend after the petition was filed, and who had not said anything critical about Carson. Not once, in 11 years, she came again after the settlement. She sat in my kitchen and looked around the house and said, "Do you want to keep it?" I thought about that. The brownstone, the neighborhood, the particular quality of the light in the kitchen on October afternoons, which was honestly beautiful. I said, "I think so. For now." She nodded. She didn't say anything else. That was the right thing to do. The thing about the study, Carson's study, the room I was sent to as a punishment, is that I've kept it. I repainted it. I got rid of the London leather chair, which had always been uncomfortable, and put in a small sofa from the furniture market. The drafting table I kept. It turns out it's actually a very good desk. I work there now. I took 2 consulting contracts in May, both in commercial real estate development, the work I know better than almost anything. I sit at the drafting table with my coffee and my laptop, and the particular early light that comes through the window that looks into the neighbor's yard. And sometimes I think about the night I walked down the hall with my pillow and sat in the dark. I've thought about what I would tell someone who is in a version of that moment, not the study part, the part before it, the years of it. The truth is that I didn't know it was happening while it was happening. While it was happening, that's the part that's hard to explain. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives as reasonableness, as logic, as a calm voice explaining why your thing is not quite right, why your timing is off, why, if you just think about it clearly, you'll see. And you do see because you trust the person, and because it's easier than not seeing, and because you believe that love is supposed to feel like that kind of safety. I don't know what love is supposed to feel like. I know what the light looks like in October. I know what a good friend sounds like on the other end of a phone at 8 in the morning. I know what it is to sign your name on a document and feel it means something. I know what it is to sit down at the desk they gave you as a punishment and start building. That's what I have. I think that's enough. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that study. Not the documents, not the attorneys, not the settlement. The thing that happened before any of that, the night I sat in the dark in a chair that was never meant for me and finally started asking honest questions. That's the part nobody talks about, the moment before the moment, the one that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Carson believed that putting me in that room would make me smaller, and I understand why he believed that it had worked before, in different ways for years. Not dramatically, that's what I want people to understand. There was no single terrible night that made everything obvious. It was accumulation. It was a wrist pressed once, then again. It was a contract I talked myself out of wanting. It was 11 years of being logicked out of my own instincts by someone I trusted to be reasonable. What I've come to think is this: the damage that control does isn't loud, it's quiet. It works by making you doubt the accuracy of your own perception. You stop trusting what you see because someone you love keeps offering you a better explanation, and eventually you stop looking. What pulled me back wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. Anger came later, and even then it was brief, more like a flash of light than a fire. What pulled me back was something simpler and harder to name. It was the question Josephine asked me on the phone that first morning. How are the assets structured? It was a practical question. It had nothing to do with feelings. And somehow that practicality was what cracked something open. It reminded me that I was a person with a professional history, with skills, with 11 years of signed documents I had never read closely enough. It reminded me that there were things I could actually know if I decided to find out. That decision, to find out, is the whole story, really. Everything else followed from it. Simone showed me the spreadsheet. Frances showed me the photo on her phone. Marcus laid documents on a table and let them speak. But none of that would have mattered if I hadn't first decided, alone in that dark room, that I was allowed to want the truth more than I wanted the peace of not knowing it. I think about the three of them often. Josephine, who listened without interrupting and then asked exactly the right question. Simone, who didn't make me explain myself twice. Frances, who had been watching quietly for years and had kept a photograph she didn't know she would need. They did not rescue me. I want to be precise about that. They handed me tools. I had to decide to pick them up. There's something in that word sitting with. The people who help you through the hardest things rarely announce themselves. They're the college roommate you've texted sporadically for 15 years. The neighbor who brings zucchini. The woman who stayed in touch even after you stopped working. Quiet loyalty is easy to overlook when things are fine, but it accumulates the same way damage does, and when you need it, it's there. What I learned about myself is harder to say neatly. I learned that I am capable of patience that looks like passivity from the outside. I learned that I can plan carefully when I have to. I learned that the version of myself who earned $400,000 a year did not disappear. She was just waiting in a room at the back of the house at a drafting table no one had ever used. I'm using it now.